Welcome back to the second edition or part two of our look at the book of Revelation here on Gospel Preaching with Chris Peltz. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ. And as we talked about on the last episode, part one, Mark Cascairo is joining us. He went through a class on the book of Revelation, looking at all of the Old Testament references, which, as you remember from the last episode, he mentioned he found over 230 references to the Old Testament, which helped build the framework for this particular class. And so we're going to get into and build on what we laid out during part one. And so I hope everyone will enjoy what Mark has to present to us here for part two. Mark, go ahead.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to just very briefly just hit the last points of our previous discussions, just to kind of enter ourselves into this new discussion. But we're just going to present a couple more, about three more key principles for understanding Revelation. We had discussed five previously, my hope is that like you said, these principles will just kind of help people when they read Revelation feel confident in their in their studies, and it will help to keep things from becoming confusing. So we'll go right into this first slide, which is just a review slide of I've got a couple of review slides of the main scriptural ideas that we find in the book of Revelation. One of the principles was to stay focused on what the main idea is, and the main purpose of the book of Revelation was to give encouragement and reassurance to Christians who were undergoing the worst persecution in history. And there will never be a worse persecution, even according to Jesus' own words. So the main ideas have to do with what we find in Romans 8:18, the idea that whatever we suffer in this life is not going to be comparable to what we're going to be able to expect in heaven. And that's definitely communicated to the Christians that received this revelation at the end of the first century during their persecution. 2 Timothy 2, verse 19, talks about how God knows his people. He has his eye on them, even in the midst of chaos and tribulation on the earth. God is able, he knows his people, and he has their interests already kind of in his hand. And so 2 Timothy 2:19 ends by saying, so let everyone that names the name of Christ depart from iniquity. Stay the course, be faithful, and don't let the earthly circumstances change your allegiance to God. You have your allegiance in the right place is kind of the message in the book of Revelation. 1 Corinthians 15:58 is kind of the same thing. Be steadfast and unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. So that's another great main message of the book of Revelation. And 2 Peter 3, verse 11 talks about the the inevitability that this earth and is going to pass away, but we look forward to another, uh, or basically earth. It's not really going to be earth. It's another home in heaven. Verse 14. Wherefore, beloved, seeing that ye look for such things, be diligent that ye may be found in him in peace, without spot and blameless. So don't be tempted to run away or to leave or to leave the paths as we strive to walk with our Lord. Stay on the trail, and it will be rewarded for that faithfulness. So that's really the main scriptural ideas that are communicated throughout the book of Revelation. And the last thing we touched on was the two questions that God is answering in the book of Revelation. He's answering these questions specifically for those Christians who are being persecuted in this great tribulation that they were going through at the end of the first century. The one predicted by Daniel, and the one that Jesus confirmed would happen after the destruction of Jerusalem. He says in Revelation 6, verse 10, um, the question here that God is answering is, how long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? So that question asked by the slain souls under the altar, right, at the opening of the fifth seal. And in Revelation 13, verse 4, as the beast is introduced, it says there that they worship the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" Well, God is also going to answer that question in the book of Revelation. And he is able to make war against the beast, and there is no contest even. So those, if we keep focused in our mind, that's the reason for the book of Revelation. Then it will help us not be led astray on these rabbit trails, trying to think about, well, what are these, these images? Are they pointing to something in the far future, even for us? No, these things are written for the benefit of those Christians undergoing that persecution. And God is answering these two questions. And of course, we benefit from reading this as well, because we see the encouragement. We see how God cares for his people. It's a great encouragement. But but we are not receiving kind of the same kind of reassurance that these Christians were, because we're not going through the tribulation that they were experiencing at the time. So we looked at these 5 principles um, last discussion. The fact that symbols are frequently used, and these symbols kind of have historic significance in the Old Testament, right? And God uses repetition. That's the second principle. And he uses repetition in the book of Revelation, right? And then how the God's message in Revelation follows the pattern seen in Revelation 1:19, that John was to write the things which he has seen, past, the things which are, present, the things which will be hereafter, the future, and specifically what God's going to do about this problem that they're facing. And then the fourth key principle was the Revelation presents multiple scenes that repeats God's communication kind of according to that pattern in Revelation 1:19. But each of those scenes and sequences kind of communicates some more information from a different perspective. So each one kind of has its own perspective. So you just have to remember that as we read through Revelation. And then the fifth key point was that Revelation's message has to be interpreted as predominantly, way predominantly relevant to the first century persecuted Christians. So we're not thinking, well, he's writing that to us so that we will recognize the signs of the times or whatever, right? No, that almost everything in the book of Revelation is relevant to the first century persecuted Christians. So what we'll do in this discussion, we're going to introduce 3 additional principles to keep in mind as you study the book of Revelation that will help us understand it. And the first of the 3 additional principles is that we need to recognize that everything written in the book of Revelation is significant and designed to encourage and reassure the persecuted Christians of the first century. There are so many over the top descriptions of things in the book of Revelation, but they might not be, for example, literal. Maybe they're not to be interpreted as being literal, but they're over the top for a reason. They're that comes up in the second additional principle, which is that there is a repeated emphasis on the overwhelming superiority of the power of God and his heavenly associates over the world powers. So all of those exaggerated, kind of just over the top descriptions are written for a reason. It's not accidental. They're written to show the power of God, the superiority of the power of God and his associates, the angels, the 4 living creatures around the throne, right? So everything is written for a reason, and it's to give the Christians who are undergoing this persecution reassurance that God is way more powerful, and all of his associates are way more powerful than the beast and even the dragon, and those who succumb sort of to this deception of them. And the third additional principle is that the symbolic message of the book of Revelation can be understood because most of the symbols appear in the Old Testament and have a direct relationship to their meaning in the book of Revelation. So That's the next thing, that these symbols, we don't have to guess what the symbols mean, because most of them have an Old Testament reference that we can read about in the Old Testament, and it tells us what it means in the Old Testament. That way, we know how to interpret it also in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation. So we'll go through those three little additional principles in a little bit of detail, and I think that'll be the end of this discussion.
Yeah, and so again, we're just kind of building this upon the foundation that was laid in part 1, putting those puzzle pieces together to get a clear image, and showing how, as you go through the book of Revelation, as we pointed out before, this isn't a completely consecutive, like, from this date all the way through one thing after another, but there are, one event talked about in 3 different ways and with 3 different figures that are being used to describe the same events.
Absolutely, that's right. So we'll look again at some of the major symbols. I think I showed pictures of these that were drawn by some young people and some adults as well. But there are lots of symbols in the book of Revelation that have sort of an equivalent in the Old Testament. They've kind of been lifted from the pages of the Old Testament, so to speak. And so I've got a list of them here. There's the image of Christ that we see in Revelation chapter 1. And the description there is almost exactly like the description of the one like a son of man who is described in Daniel chapter 10 and also mentioned in Daniel chapter 12. So then there's a throne scene in heaven that we see in chapters 4 and 5 of Revelation. And and we also see that same general throne scene in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 1 and 10. And so we get some identifying information from that Old Testament reference, so that we're kind of oriented in what we're looking at in the book of Revelation in chapters 4 and 5. Then we've got the two witnesses. That's in Revelation chapter 11. And in Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter, verse 6, we see the principle of the two witnesses, that no matter is to be determined except by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. The idea was that that's when the testimony can be dependable and can be trustworthy, so to speak, right? Um, unless you, of course, you have some really nefarious characters that are just banding together and trying to get someone in trouble, like they did Jesus. They tried to find false witnesses, right? That would testify something false against Jesus. But for the most part, the idea of the two witnesses, having two witnesses, was that a matter can be determined dependably. That it wasn't just the whim of one person. So in the book of Revelation, two witnesses is used to kind of depict the gospel message and how the plan of God is being carried out, and the word of God is going forth throughout the uh, the world, and being confirmed by miracles that follow it, right? Just as Jesus said in Mark the 16th chapter, verses 18 through 20. So the two witnesses are they also have a a reference in Second Kings chapter 1 verses 9 through 13, um, which is kind of the idea where Elijah uh, was being summoned by some of the king's men for no good reason, and they're going to basically try to imprison Elijah, but fire came down from heaven. And so there's the two witnesses that have these characteristics that are described in Second Kings, that they had the power, the same kind of power that Elijah demonstrated in that Old Testament passage. Then there's the dragon, that serpent of old, the Genesis 3, chapters 1 through 13. We see that there. The beast. This is a super big key. Daniel, the 7th chapter, 4 verses 4 through 7, describes this beast, and it's just one of the passages in Daniel that describes this beast and how it has many of the same characteristics as the beast described in Revelation chapter 13. And there's the harlot riding the beast. Again, and sitting on many waters. Okay, the waters we are told in the book of Revelation, symbolizing the, the peoples of the earth. So in Jeremiah 51 and Isaiah 1, we kind of see Old Testament references kind of helping us understand that um, image. And then the plagues are mentioned. The different plagues are mentioned at least 3 times in the book of Revelation, talking about where God's response to this persecution against his people is discussed. And those plagues often have great resemblance to the plagues that we saw in Exodus chapter 7 through 11. So just to show that we can understand these symbols, and most of the time they are symbols, and it may not necessarily be literal, blood being, your water being turned into blood, in God's response to the beast, for example. But the idea is there that the plagues are going to happen, and the beast is going to be, um, a response, a judgment is going to be given to the beast, and symbolized with these plagues. So here are some of the symbols, some of the major symbols we see in the book of Revelation. There is the image of Jesus. Here's the throne scene. We've kind of looked at these before, but all of these symbols. Here's the horsemen. Even the horsemen have uh, Old Testament references. Believe that is in the book of Zechariah. And then here's the woman and the dragon. Um, the the dragon, especially having the Old Testament reference, and the woman, um, often kind of associated with, um, probably the closest thing in the Old Testament to describing this woman is maybe wisdom, as is discussed in Proverbs. But the idea is that the woman is kind of the source, or sort of what brings about. It's the history and maybe the plan of God that brings about the coming of the Christ, and then the creation of the church.
And even in Genesis 3, right, with, from your seed, the seed of woman,
Yes,
right?
that's a good point. So here's the dragon again, the serpent of old, and here's Michael and chaining the dragon. So all these images. Here's that beast of Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 13, with the 7 heads and the 10 horns, and how those details are described in both the Old and the New Testament. And so it helps us to see that, who are we talking about? We're talking about the kingdom, the Roman Empire, okay, and various kings associated with that Roman Empire. So we can be sure that we're interpreting that correctly if we compare it to the image found in the Old Testament. And here again is the harlot sitting on the beast again, with the 7 heads and the 10 horns, and on many waters. Okay, there's that other Old Testament reference. So these are symbols that we can see, that are very visual, that John is shown, and he's to write about these. And so we can understand what they represent, because the Bible tells us what they represent, whether it's right there in the book of Revelation or whether it's in the Old Testament, kind of equivalent of those things.
Yeah. So Mark, when
Yeah.
when looking at this, and just to kind of reiterate a little bit of what you had said, even in part one of this two-part series, you've got the things that were that he saw, things that are, and things that will be. The spreading of the gospel, and some of the things that went along with that, and the persecution that went along with that, the persecution that now is, right, that they're going through and suffering through now, and then the judgment that will come from God, and the victory that the saints will have
Right.
through that persecution.
Right. I want to say that next slide kind of shows that. So I think
Oh,
we'll be
I got
getting
a
into
little
a
ahead of you.
couple.
That's all right.
That's okay, but we'll be getting to a couple of slides that kind of diagram that. So
Yeah.
that's a great point. So I was just going to mention some key ideas, or what I called anchor phrases, when I went through this and began to kind of see the consistency here. I called these anchor phrases because they also help us, as we're reading through the book of Revelation, to understand what it is exactly we're talking about. So there, what you'll find in the book of Daniel, and most of these anchor phrases are found basically as a correlation between the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. In fact, I don't think many of these things are found anywhere else besides those two books. So this 1260 days, the 42 months, and the times and a half, that is a period of time that is found, and it's sometimes described in the days, or sometimes it's described in months, and sometimes it's described in the years, right? The times and a half a time, 3.5 years, and they're all equivalent, right? They all are descriptions of the same period of time in terms of actual time, right? 1260 days is 42 months if we count the months as 30-day months, and 42 months is 3.5 years if we count the times and a half a time as 3.5 years. So those are consistent, and so sometimes the 1260 days is mentioned to describe something that's happening. Sometimes 42 months is mentioned to describe a time in which something has happened, and sometimes times and half a time is mentioned to describe something that's a time in which something is happening. But in every case, what becomes clear is that this time that is described either by 1260 days, 42 months, or times and a half a time, that time is always describing the time when the Christians are to be persecuted during the reign of that fourth empire. Okay, when the time of persecution occurs, that time of persecution is described as occurring over 1260 days or 42 months or times and a half. So that's why I call it an anchor phrase, because what will happen is in the book of Daniel, it talks about when the Christians will be persecuted using that anchor phrase and one of those kinds of descriptions of time. But in the book of Revelation, the same thing is done. Something will happen. The beast is given power during that same period of time. Or the woman is persecuted in the wilderness for that same period of time. Or the two witnesses are prophesying in sackcloth for that same period of time. It refers to the time when the Christians are being persecuted at the hands of the Roman Empire, and which is very relevant to where these Christians are right now, who are receiving the revelation. They're in the middle of that persecution. They're within the 1260 days. They're living in the 42 months and the times and a half a time. So that's super important to recognize that, because whenever you see that description of that period of time, you're talking about the same thing. You're talking about the time in which the Roman Empire is persecuting the Christians in a way that the Lord says is the worst tribulation that ever has happened and that ever will happen. Matthew 24, verse 21. So just remember that. That helps us as we read to stay anchored in, okay, this is what we're talking about now. And that's how you can know that there's repetition of these kind of these scenes. So, you'll be in one sequence of scenes. For example, the horsemen and their horses of different colors, right? And then you'll get to something where it will say, 1260 days or 42 months or something like that. You'll see the um, the that period of time described, and then you go to another one of those things, like the woman uh, who is ready to give birth to the child, and then you see that she is also persecuted for that same period of time, 1260 days or 42 months or however it's said. So you can see that there are two separate descriptions of what's happening, even though one follows the other in the book, but they're including the same time period within that description, within each description. So it's just a repetition of the description of the persecuted time that the Christians are going through.
Another account of the same event.
Yes. So it's why it's an anchor phrase. It kind of it helps you realize, okay, this is another telling of the same thing I read back then, because that same anchor phrase was used back then, right? And so the beast is another kind of anchor phrase or key idea. Whenever you see the beast is often used to show this is who we're talking about. When God is dealing with people, oftentimes when he's meeting out the plagues, like, well, okay, now who are these plagues going toward? Is it some people like way in the future, even for us? But it, the book of Revelation is very good about telling us exactly who it is. It's those who have the mark of the beast on their foreheads or on their hand. So it helps anchor us. This is what we're talking about. We're not talking about something in the future. We're talking about God's response to that persecution by the Roman Empire, and the plagues will come against those who basically are deceived and side with the beast and are in persecution of the Christians there, right? So the beast helps us stay anchored. And then the other thing is this discussion of the tribulation. So the tribulation is, I don't know that there's any other tribulation ever spoken of in the Bible that is not referring to this particular time in which the Christians were persecuted by the beast or the Roman Empire, this particular emperor of the Roman Empire. And so whenever you see that discussion of the tribulation, you know what you're talking about. It's that same thing. So we're not talking about a tribulation that's going to be coming up in the future. 7 years of tribulation. You often hear that in popular discussions about the book of Revelation, but it's not about something that's going to happen in the future. It's about the tribulation that these Christians were going through at the time that they received this letter. Okay, so then we have a couple of diagrammatic slides that just kind of show that. So here I've got depicted the first, the top two lines there are really the opening of the seven seals and the seven trumpets that kind of are a result of opening the seven seals, the seventh seal. And so remember that was the first sort of telling of the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will come hereafter. And then underneath that is the two witnesses. See that little timeline there. The two witnesses. That's the second telling of the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will come hereafter. And the third one is at the bottom. That is the woman who is ready to give birth to the child who is caught up to heaven, and then the dragon is defeated in the battle in heaven and thrown to the earth, and he goes after the other offspring of the woman who are the Christians being persecuted, right? So that explains why are you going through this persecution? Because Satan has lost the battle in heaven. The Christ child, succeeded in doing what he came to do, that is save people from their sins. And therefore the dragon lost that battle. He is wroth, and he is now going after the other offspring of the woman, because the Lord is in heaven at the right hand of God and untouchable, right? As far as he's concerned. So that's, and we see here the 1260 days, 42 months, the times and a half a time. So that that time is within those stories. Here's another way to look at it. The smaller parentheses up at the top, underneath that top timeline, shows when that 42 months occurred. See, there was a period when the gospel was being preached. There was some persecution, but the time of the Gentiles hadn't started yet. It doesn't start until after the destruction of Jerusalem, sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem, probably 20 years or so, to put us at the time when John receives this revelation. So we see that the 1260 days involves the escalated persecution and the death that the Christians are experiencing at this point. And it goes into and goes on unto the time that the beast is judged. Okay. So that's what the 42 months, 1260 days, and the times and half a time, that's what it represents. And so we see that also here, mentioned in various. These are the passages in the book of Revelation where that time period is mentioned.
Mm.
Revelation 11:2, Revelation 11:3, Revelation 12:6, and Revelation 13:5-7. Okay, so that's just it's an important anchor phrase to know about. And then the very last slide I have here is just this one, which is a timeline really of that includes 1,000 years, because this is also something that's very important to understand as we read through the book of Revelation. Is what is this 1,000 years? Because it really is. It's kind of at the end of God's letter, his revelation to John for his persecuted, struggling people on the earth. This comes at the end in verses 19 and 20. And it's really kind of like this is the sort of the climax of the whole story. This is where God says, this is what I'm going to do. This is encapsulating my response to the question, how long, O Lord, before you avenge the blood of your saints, right? Basically, and who is able to make war with the beast? Well, this 1,000-year discussion in chapters 19 and 20 is kind of where all that comes to a head. And if we understand, if we read carefully the context in chapters 19 and 20, then we'll get an understanding of what this 1,000 years means and why it's so important. So, there have been many things said about this 1,000 years. A lot of, I think the most popular thing that people hear the most is about 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. Okay, that's one of the things I hear. You hear of anything else, Chris, besides that?
No, I mean that's the most popular for sure with premillennialism. That Jesus will come to earth and reign for 1,000 years from Jerusalem on the throne of David for a very specific amount of time. You know, the 1,000 year is literal.
Right, and it is on the earth as we mentioned
Yeah.
too. And so the important thing to realize is that a careful reading, you know, just an attentive reading of chapters 19 and 20 will show that that's not at all what the
Yeah, you're
1,000
right.
years
Yeah, not at all.
is about, right?
Exactly.
So we see on the timeline there's a little extension in front of the timeline where we have this is really kind of the 42 months or the 1,260 days is in a green arrow here. And so it means that that's the time represented when the Christians were being persecuted. In Revelation chapter 19, we see that the 1,000 years begins when the beast is thrown into the lake of fire. So that signals the end of that 42 months. The beast is given power for 42 months. His power ends when he's thrown into the lake of fire, right? So we see, and the 1,000 years begins. And then there's a judgment that occurs there too. And part of that judgment is the beast being thrown into the lake of fire. Another part of the judgment has to do with what happens to God's people, the saints, those who've already been beheaded. We're told that the beheaded, will reign with Christ 1,000 years. So that's the beginning of the 1,000 years. Also, when those who were beheaded are allowed to reign with Christ for that 1,000 years. And then there's a third thing that happens at the beginning of that 1,000 years, and that's found in chapter 20. And that is that Satan is bound with a great chain, and he is thrown into a pit where he will stay imprisoned, basically, for 1,000 years. So he can no longer deceive the nations, is what the context says there. So this 1,000 years has to do, it has its beginning with this judgment, God's judgment against the beast and really against Satan. There's a restriction put on Satan. He's chained. He's not allowed to do the same kind of harm that he was able to do during that 42 months of the 1,260 days, right? So it doesn't mean necessarily that Satan is totally powerless, but it means he's not unleashed. He's not unbridled. But God put an end to that kind of power that Satan had that he gave to the beast in order to implement this persecution, which was the worst ever. So that's not going to be able to happen again. So that it's just important to notice that the 1,000 years begins with those three things, right? The beast thrown into the lake of fire. That's the end of that Roman emperor. Okay, in that particular dynasty, I guess you might say, um, the those who suffered death at the hands of the beast were allowed to reign with Christ beginning then as 1,000 years. And then Satan was bound for 1,000 years. So that's what initiates the 1,000 years. And again, this is not on the earth. The beheaded reign with Christ in heaven. So that Christ is with him. They are with him in heaven and before the throne. And so they will have their tears wiped away by Christ himself, right? So it's a very different story than what is the popular one that goes around. And at the end of the 1,000 years, it says that the rest of the dead, those that were beheaded, were raised and they were allowed to reign with Christ for 1,000 years. But it says, but the rest of the dead will not rise again until after the 1,000 years. So the 1,000 years really is kind of bookended with the judgment of the beast, the chaining of Satan, and the resurrection of those who were killed in that horrible persecution. And on the other end, the other bookend is the second resurrection, the resurrection of all the dead, which is described in chapter 20
Mhm.
at the end, right?
Right.
And then the judgment follows that. So basically, what we see is if we want to understand the book of Revelation, this is God's ultimate reassurance to the Christians who are receiving the revelation. They are concerned about the persecution that's happening around them. It's horrible. It's worse than any that's ever happened before or will ever happen again. But God is saying, number one, you stay faithful because you have a reward that no one can take away from you. But number two, those who have already died are going to be taken care of. They're going to be in a great place. You're not going to, they're not going to miss out on the reward at all. They So see how reassuring that has to be for them that God has a plan for them. And the other thing that it helps us to understand is that we are now living in the 1,000 years because we're after the fall of that particular Roman dynasty that was responsible in conjunction with Satan for the worst persecution ever against Christians, okay, in history. And we're also on this side of the judgment. So we're still within that 1,000 years. So it's not a literal 1,000
Yeah,
years.
right. Yeah. That's the big key. We're not looking at it 1,000 year literal, reign. I mean, he's reigning, and right now we're as you said, um, you know, prior to the final judgment that's going to take place. But ultimately, we know for the saved, for the Christians, there's going to be victory in the glories of heaven, and that's such an encouraging aspect to have, a view to have for all the saved of all time. And the book of Revelation, I think, just really brings that out in a less intimidating way. I think from the way you've presented it, the way you've kind of laid this out for us to you kind of put into check our approach and our view of this particular book. So I really just appreciate you putting these slides together and kind of going through these principles that you've pointed out, and really, I think helping. It certainly helped me, and I think it'll help others who are interested in trying to figure out the book of Revelation.
Appreciate that, Chris. And the key sort of encouragement is just keep these kinds of major points in mind as you read through. And like this last slide uh, is sort of referencing what we talked about before, is a careful reading of the
Mhm.
of the passage. Don't just read what's there, and
Yeah.
it tells you, the Bible tells you whether you have to look at Old Testament references or whether it's right there in the book of Revelation, which is the case in chapters 19 and 20, the answers are right there. We don't have to make something up or embellish to try to make it fit, an idea that we have. Just
Mm.
let the Bible tell you what it's saying, and I think we'll come away with a I think a consistent message.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thank you very much. And for those who are listening and paying attention, whether it's on a podcast or if you're on podcast, you want to see the slides that have been presented, you can look for it on Gospel Preaching with Chris Peltz on YouTube. And of course, we appreciate everyone who shares out the videos, the podcast, and everything else that we are doing. And so until next time, remember to keep studying that word, keep looking into the Word of God, and understand that as has been pointed out, the Bible is its best own commentary.